This is indyref Radio, Yes Group Spotlight, and this edition we're featuring the campaign for a clean currency in an independent Scotland. The campaign is headed up by Andy Anderson, and in this podcast, Andy and the other core members of the group meet up to discuss where they are at the moment in terms of the campaign, where they see the campaign headed, and what resources they'd need to take the campaign forward. If you're wondering what a clean currency is, what Andy says is, Scotland must return to a sound and clean currency which meets the real requirements of the Scottish economy, is under the control of the elected Government of Scotland, and is in line with Scotland's written constitution. He also says, money's real economic role is as a medium of exchange in the market. That's the role of money, or currency. It is not a commodity in the market. It is a medium of exchange, and like everything else in the economy, money is most efficient when it sticks to what it does best. If that's intrigued you, listen to the podcast. The meeting is chaired by Maggie Chetty, and you'll hear Andy Anderson speaking, also Ronnie Morrison, Julian Smith, Agnes Macaulay, and Leah Gunn Barrett. Not necessarily in that order. There are also some questions and answers that are interspersed between the various contributions from those speakers. We hope you enjoy the next hour or so on the subject of a clean currency in an independent Scotland.
We'll kick off, shall we? This is a get-together, really, of the Clean Scottish Currency Group. We've been going, the Clean Currency Group, I think, for about 3 years, and it was Andy and Ronnie who brought us together in Glasgow, and we had people really from all over Scotland who've been part of the group. And like some people have mentioned, we're all very committed to getting a new Scotland and a new clean currency, and banking that hasn't got the horrific wild gambling behaviour that we saw in the banks in 2008. We want a Scotland that develops a good, solid economy that's based on real wealth. And we have to give our thanks really to Andy and Ronnie for the work that they put into this. And we must thank Andy for the things that the groups that he's set up and the journeys that he's made to set up new groups. So welcome to everybody who's here, and I would like to welcome Andy to say a bit more about his thinking on clean currency and where we're at, because we've made a bit of progress over this period while we've all been in lockdown, and Andy's going to say a bit about that. Andy?
Ronnie and I, as I say, met in the run-up to the referendum before, and we were horrified about what would happen if we were tied in with the pound and shared in the pound. We didn't think that was a very good idea. And we spent some time thinking about it and decided to write. And we published the book Moving On in February of that year before the referendum. The reality is that we got very, very little support from people. We had great difficulty selling any of the books. We had great difficulty getting people to pay attention to this issue. And people told us at that time, look, the currency issue has been settled. It's all in hand. Alex Salmon knows exactly what's going to happen. It's all dealt with. Don't rock the boat. We're coming up to the referendum. Don't get into problems about currency. Nobody wants to know. So we didn't get a very good reception for that period. And we sat like there are many people and watched the latter part of the referendum when we found out that the other side were quite prepared to tear us apart on the question of currency and what's your options and what's your alternative and what have you. And we watched all that and we saw to some extent the campaign crumble around that, because up to that point we were doing quite well in the campaign. And the campaign just crumbled after that. So after that period, there was a great demand by people to want to know about currency. And then we started selling the books and sold, in fact, the whole first lot in a couple of years. And we've had to put out another edition. We didn't change the book, and the book more or less stayed as it was. We expected quite a bit of feedback to it, but we never got any real serious criticism of it. And I, in one sense, was a bit disappointed about that, because I knew that there were flaws in what we had written. This is the nature of the world, and I expected people to come back and make some serious challenges to what we're saying. It's good for your development to have that sort of thing. It didn't actually happen with the book. But what we then decided to do was to try and, having built up a group of people, built up an organisation throughout Scotland, we wanted then to try and get some sort of unity among the people on the left who were anxious to have our own currency and to adopt a different line. We could see that was developing. More and more people were making this point, and we wanted to sort of link with that because we wanted unity. And our thinking at that time was this, that rather than get everybody everywhere in Scotland to agree exactly the type of currency we'd need, the type of banking reforms we'd need, and every aspect of it totally agreed by everybody, what we needed to do was to look at this in two stages. Stage one, what happened before the referendum? Build up a case and a unity on the basis of that. And if we can build up a unity on that, what happens after the referendum is another part, is stage two, is a different part of the game. So we wanted to split it in two ways, for this reason, that before the referendum, the issues that are going to be important are ones that can unite quite a lot of people. They need to be fairly general. They don't need to be in great detail, but they need to be clear and fairly general in what we're about to do. Have our own currency, have our own central bank, get that done as soon as possible and establish that. That's what we want. That's what we wanted unity on. We wanted unity on that because we knew that a very large number of people could unite around those simple issues. When we go further after the referendum, then it'll be a different ballgame, because then we've got to talk in much more detail about the type of reforms that we need in the banking, etc. So we wanted that two-stage approach. Initially, we approached Commonweal, and we spent a lot of time trying to get discussions going with Rob McAlpine, as many of you will remember. And we didn't get very far. We weren't making any progress at all. I later had discussions with Tim Rideout, and there we got a better approach, and at least a basis for some understanding that we could proceed on those initial points, and we could look at other aspects. Since that time, that has developed a bit, having. Now, it would be false to suggest that we have all, from different groups, got a common position. That's not the case. But we have got a clear understanding that certain things have to be done. And one of these things that has to be done is that we need to have a common public approach before the referendum, so that we're not fighting with each other over details about banking reform in the middle of the referendum, because the other side will use that if we were to do that. So that we don't want to do. That doesn't mean to say that there's agreement. There is very big differences between us yet, and we are continuing to debate and argue about these differences. But I think we're in a position where we may get a common approach on fronting up to the referendum, and I think that's important, and that's a target we set ourselves a long time ago. We wondered if we would ever get there. I think to some extent we're approaching a position where we might get that. We might get a broad approach here. If we do that, that is helpful. That doesn't mean to say that we can relax on much of the other stuff we've got to do, the work that we've got to do. We've got to continue with that. We've got to continue with the debate and the discussion that we're having with the other groups. That's as much as I want to say at the moment, but I'll answer any questions that people have got.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks very much. I think it's quite important to bear in mind that the issues that we're discussing, currency, banking, kind of future economy, are issues that are complicated issues. And some of the questions that have been raised with us, and indeed are being raised all the time, is how can we give people the arguments to talk to their no voting friends? And I think that is the central question, really, that we have to address in the course of what we've been doing. And those of us who've grappled with some of these difficult ideas, you know very well that you can't answer these questions with a short slogan. But I do think it should be in our minds about how we set about educating ourselves and others. I think it's the key thing that we have to do. So I'm going to ask Leah Gunn Barrett if Leah would join us now to talk about training and discussion. Okay, Leah.
Right. Well, I mean, Maggie, I think all I can really say is the reason I think that we need to get a clear message across to, say, the Yes groups or the National Yes Network or the universe out there that supports independence on currency. I think we can be simple. We can have maybe a fact sheet, which starts with the idea that unless you have your own currency, you're not actually independent. Those of you who've read The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton makes it very clear between nations that are currency users and currency issuers. The United States is obviously a currency issuer. We have a central bank, the Federal Reserve, that issues dollars. The UK has the Bank of England, issues pound sterling. You've got the European Central Bank that issues euros. If we ever wanted to rejoin the European Union as an independent state, Scotland, we would have to have our own currency. So that's a starting point. Now, the issue is, do we want to rejoin the EU or join EFTA? That's something for the Scottish people to decide upon independence, I believe. It's sort of getting ahead of the game. But having your own currency is fundamental to being able to do what an independent nation needs to do, which is to look after its people, to invest in, say, a green economy, which I think we need to do if the planet's not going to burn, to invest in education and a health service. We need to be able to control our economy, our imports and our exports. So we need your own currency. It's fundamental. And many small countries have done this. Andy uses the example, Andy and Ronnie in their books, of Iceland. It's a country, it's independent. It's the population of Edinburgh. And, you know, they have managed perfectly well. So I think, first of all, just to reassure people that this is completely normal. Other countries who've been on the road to independence, you know, Croatia, Estonia, some of the East European former Soviet Union, members of the Soviet Union have actually made a great success of independence, and many have had their own currency. Some have gone to the euro, some have stuck with their own currencies. So it, first of all, is to demystify it. that this is completely normal. And when you are a currency issuing nation, you have certain power. You can invest, and you don't have to go with a begging bowl, as we currently do, to Westminster and ask for money, for all the services that we need for our people to prosper, for a well-being economy. So as a currency issuing nation, you can incur debt. In fact, debt's probably not a good word to use. It's a better word to use savings, because everything's a zero-sum game. If the government spends money, it goes somewhere. It goes into the pockets, into the private sector, into bank accounts, into investment for small firms. I was earlier today listening to an economist named Richard Werner, who was talking about the state of global banking. He's done lots of research, empirical research. He's worked all over the world. And he's German originally. And he said one thing about Germany is that they have a network, a very robust network. 70 or 80% of all of their banks are community banks that are based in the local community. And their remit, they have to lend in a certain geographical area. And they lend to small and medium-sized businesses, which are the majority of the economy. And this is kind of what we're missing in the United Kingdom, where we're dominated by 5 large commercial banks. And we've all seen the impact of their lending for speculation, for investing in land and property. In other words, non-productive purposes. And then that's when you see productivity fall. That's when you see all the issues and the depreciation of sterling and all the stagflation of problems we've had in the UK economy, because we don't have the banking system serving the people, or the people who actually need it. That is the businesses who need to invest and actually create wealth. Because remember that any currency is merely a measure of what a country's wealth is. And Scotland, by any measure, is very wealthy. We have an educated population. We have an abundance and a huge richness of natural resources. We have a developed economy. So there's no reason why we couldn't be very, very successful along the lines of some other small Nordic countries. So I think it's just getting that message across clearly, using examples of other countries that have been successful, that have done it, and be able to come back when these unionists make these ridiculous arguments that, we are dependent on Westminster sending us money. We send money to Westminster, only get a fraction back. So I'm thinking if we could just put these maybe down in simple soundbite phrases that people can understand, maybe have a fact sheet on currency, maybe one on debt, because there's always a question of, we have this huge debt here in Scotland, billions, or GERS, the GERS system, which is an accounting system that was imposed on us by the Tories, which does not actually reflect Scotland's economy at all. In fact, we don't even have a lot of data showing what our economy is. So I think maybe that's one way, is to put together, and I could use the help of many of you to do that. I did this kind of thing when I worked in New York in an entirely different area in gun control, where we had fact sheets on various issues to try to educate people about the issue. So this might be something, and then people could use these, and if people are so inclined to write to the Herald or the Scotsman or the Edinburgh Evening News or local papers to try to refute some of these arguments that are constantly being put out there, why Scotland can't make it on its own. Then that maybe that slow drip approach, and if we're all saying the same consistent thing in simple terms that people can understand, that might be an effective way to try to get the message across. And also when people are speaking to their friends and neighbors, if they have these resources handy, available to look and to refresh their memory about what the issues actually are, then that could be, I think, very helpful. So that's all I would suggest. And I'm welcome to any points of view that you guys might have.
Thanks very much, Leah. Great. I guess listening to your talking, one of the things that strikes me quite powerfully is also being able to generate a sense of confidence about what we're doing. People are so anxious about it, and if we want to promote a sense of we can do it, we need to have those kind of confident arguments that you've spoken about. and be able to get these across in meetings and elsewhere, and of course in letter columns and all of that. So thanks so much for that. Thank you.
Yeah. And just to say, Maggie, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, obviously, I'm not from Scotland originally. I'm American. I'm a dual citizen. But one thing, when I came here and I started looking into this issue, I was amazed at how people are not confident. How can you not be confident? You live in this amazing country with all this fabulous potential.
Yeah.
And people say, oh, but we've been put down for 300 years, the Scottish cringe. I'm like, get over yourselves. That is ridiculous. Come on. Where's your fighting spirit? Let's get out there and do this, because it's such a compelling argument. I can't think of one that's more compelling today. We should do this.
And of course, we've got many new Italian supporters now who are going to help us in our task. Thanks so much, Leah. Can we now have Agnes Macaulay, who is Agnes from Inverclyde, who has been one of our most staunch, hardworking members. Okay, Agnes.
Thank you. I think I've met nearly everybody here. I started off, and probably still am, in the same boat as most people here, which is I didn't know anything about currency and the economy, remembered the awful debate on TV with Alistair Darling, and then thought, but I don't know the answer here. So we started from Inverclyde SNP to do some public meetings, because we thought we could usefully do some political education for our own members, but we also opened it up to the public, so not just for the branch. And Andy was one of the early speakers, turned up with the books. We had, at that point, the book he'd written with Ronnie called Moving On, and an earlier edition of a smaller book that's the currency one. So we had Andy come and speak. I was saying, just tell us what to say on the doorstep, Andy. Just give me 20 minutes, that'll do. And I realised that wasn't possible. But what was possible, by dint of having Andy there in terms of getting the word out to the public, was there was somebody there to talk to us confidently about economic issues at a level that was pitched to us. I know that he couldn't do what I was hoping for, is within 2 hours make me confident on the doorstep. But what we did do as a result was, after Andy's talk, lots of people were interested and they bought the books. They didn't know what they were buying, including me, but we bought the books because people wanted to read for themselves. So it stimulated that. And secondly, we were able then to set up 4 small study groups where we had Andy in someone's house doing one 5-person group after another. So a few people went forward and got a little more training. But although I think it wouldn't make them want to go on and become trainers, it actually really has helped locally sow the seeds of Scotland can afford to do this. And I'm not sure we entirely thought that before. So we're still trying to do the same thing. So as a result of, I think, talking further at meetings with Maggie and Andy, starting cold to talk about fiat currency or fractional reserves kind of makes people blank out. So we started to talk about how, if Scotland had control of its own economy, what would that practically mean? So as Leah said, a Green New Deal, what does that mean? So that's the way we're starting to now, is to talk about what in a new Scotland we could use our wealth for, to try and get people thinking about wealth rather than money. So I can say a little bit more about what we're planning to do now. And I think the other thing we did to get the word out was it gave some of us confidence to try writing resolutions for SNP conference. I would never have done that. So I know Jim here also did that. And we used this network to pick up on SNP members and share draft resolutions that we try to get people in this network taking to their local branch and putting into the SNP. And although that didn't necessarily get us the clear result I thought it was going to get us, we nevertheless, a few years ago, really kind of had a grassroots move from the conference floor, from branches, flagging, this is the kind of economy we want to see run. We don't want sterlingization, we want control over our own economy. And I think that was really felt within the party. So that was, I think, only probably about 8 branches submitting resolutions. So in terms of getting the word out, it does spread it if people who go to conference or who can see that you're pushing something about economics in a simple way. And I remember Jim actually stood on the platform to speak to it, which I thought was immensely brave. So I think there are numerous ways of getting the word out, and I can talk a bit more about what I'm doing locally to see if that's useful for anyone else to either copy or join in on. We are following the idea of having a speaker because it's a good way into the topic for people. It's just to have someone talk about it in a really popular way. So a few years ago, I nobbled Andy and said, would you come and talk? So now I've booked Kate Forbes to come so that she can do a meeting to talk about well-being economics. There's very good polling on that done by Believe in Scotland, where they're just trying to get over the message that you can't have a healthy economy without a well-functioning society. You can't get a well-functioning society without a healthy economy. As Andy said, it's not talking in detail, but it's a way of engaging members to just get a little bit of understanding that is enough so that when they talk to their friends and neighbours, or maybe even we write a letter to local papers, we can say the kind of economy what we want in future is one run for the benefit of the people, and start talking about that. So my thoughts were, we have Kate Forbes to come. Because that's going to be a Zoom event, in some ways it's really much easier now that you can get the word out on Eventbrite, and people do not necessarily need to trail to Inverclyde, to the Beacon, to hear someone. And they've proven very popular. There's a big appetite for these meetings. And so we're going to do Kate Forbes at the end of September, who's going to talk about a well-being economy and the COVID recovery. I'll put a link in with the First Minister's TED Talk on well-being economics, the polling from Believe in Scotland, and we can put in further reading probably to, Stephanie Kelton or anything else for the interested. What I hoped we could then probably do is promote the idea of doing further study groups over Zoom for people who are interested in taking it a little bit further. I don't know until we run the meeting whether we will get more interest, but when we had Andy there for a couple of hours a few years ago, absolutely people did want to know. The second event I've booked is a month later, where we've got Neil Gray, who was the co-convener of the Social Justice Commission, or deputy convener. So that feels like the second half of the story. If you had control over your own economy, what is it that you want to try and put right? What's socially unjust about Scotland, and what kind of ways can we apply that economy for the benefit of people? So because it's Eventbrite now, we can get the word out, in the national, over Scotland, very widely, and people can just join in from the comfort of their own home. So that was my thinking, was to try and talk about the economy by, I'm sorry to say, using, quite frankly, getting a prestige figure like Kate Forbes to come and talk will probably bring people in. Plenty of people came for Andy, but I know that people do come just to hear a well-known person speak. And that can be just give folk a little entry into the topic, and then maybe from that we can also offer further study groups. And I'll do the same after we get Neil Gray talking on the Social Justice Commission. And then I'm finally hoping to book, Mike Russell, because if by December we are not got anything to say on an independence campaign, I'm hoping that absolutely will fuel people to want to know how we're going to afford things. You know, people are going to remember what happened in 2014. The other thing we've been doing is we have a table outside our local Yes shop. I know we can't do street stalls yet, really, but the first edition of Andy's currency book, the little one that, you know, has been updated. We had bought quite a lot of those and had some from Andy. So we've put them out free on the table so that people stop by and lift it. And it's been quite surprising over the past few weeks. You know, maybe 10 folk have taken the book and they come in and talk about fiat currency, much to my surprise. So with the old edition, it's quite a good freebie to maybe entice people in on a street stall if we ever get to the point where we can do anything like that. And I finally just want to back what Leah's saying. Some simple fact sheets, that kind of thing would be very useful. I would be a bit nervous about doing it myself, but I'd be happy to work and provide the perspective of the uninformed and the level at which, if it's pitched for me, it's probably okay for the public.
Thanks very much, Agnes. That's very helpful. I'm wondering if Jim Osborne has actually joined us. Is Jim there by any chance? Because Jim expressed an interest in being here tonight, and he also has written. If people read the National, he's written some very interesting stuff, including the thing that I found very interesting on pensions, which I think is hugely helpful. The whole idea of using local authority pension funds to actually help to put them to good usage, to do helpful infrastructure building, particularly like housing, low-cost housing and that sort of thing. And I think these are absolutely the kinds of ideas that will be attractive to people and will get across the idea that we do actually have funds at our disposal that can be put to better use than simply being put into supporting big banks and all sorts of things. So I'm going to suggest now that people come in to make points or ask questions. Now is the chance for people to come in and have their say, which is what we're here to do tonight.
Can I pick Marlene's brains here? I know you've got things we can listen to on Indie Live Radio. I wondered about, some people have said to me they would like, when we get back to a world in which we can do real meetings, whether we could actually have hybrid events where we retain some kind of online access for people either to spectate or to submit questions ahead, but really certainly just to listen in to someone talking. And I suppose if we were organising relatively big names to come and do a talk, it really struck me this is the next level of technical competence we really need, is to be able to provide it online so that people can join in some way. And I thought, I just don't know how to do that. And I wondered if we should be thinking about from our branch, let's say, to try it, paying those parts of the indie movement, maybe like Indie Live Radio, to say, can you handle, if we pay you, some of taking forward the technical side of us doing meetings? Because I thought, actually, nowadays, why shouldn't anyone hear Kate Forbes or somebody else from any part of Scotland? Because we can advertise it, but I would be horrified at trying to do the technical side. So it felt like it felt like the next stage was to try and do events. I know that Tim Rideout and others have certainly done alternative conferences and things like that, but that did seem really useful to try and sort out getting the word out online and or with real meetings, but actually getting some expert broadcast help, and we pay you for it.
I'm sorry, Agnes, I'm sitting here chuckling because in my experience, that's the first time anyone's ever offered to pay anyone independent live for doing something. So I'll take that back to the team meeting next week. That's really good. There'll certainly be no problem doing that. I mean, obviously with the radio, what we're doing is recording audio. But then there's also Indie Live itself, which, has got a lot of experience about setting up, doing exactly what you said, helping set up and then record meetings and getting the video of it as well. And I mean, these days it doesn't even need that much technical expertise, but still a good idea from your point of view to have someone present, who's looking after it, and you don't need to worry about it, because I mean, there's lots, and one of the things that's come out of this last year is all these Zoom meetings, and we've got a huge amount of recordings on our on-demand platforms about them. So, and it does mean that someone has a meeting, and then we get involved either at the radio or video recording, and we can extend the reach of that meeting, by several times over, if not, more, tens of times over, actually. So yeah, let's keep in contact about that, because it can certainly help.
It would be really helpful. We had a member who was fairly technically accomplished who turned some of the talks into podcasts, and I'm going, I have no idea how he did it. But actually, we were finding when we counted up the downloads, it was, I think we had about 1,500. Mm-hmm. I was amazed. So kind of cross-fertilizing, so that maybe through branches and meetings, we promote links to where people can hear or see things that are already available. But likewise, if I enjoy organising the meetings, but I thought my heart sinks at the thought of trying to do anything technical. So what we talked about was saying we need to just buy that in. Obviously, we'd need permission in future from speakers, but I think we could probably get that. But at the minute, we just needed to say there's something else we need to do to extend the reach of anything we do. And I don't know why I hadn't thought of all of this before the pandemic, but I'm a late convert to Zoom and online. I absolutely get it now.
Can I ask if Julian's there? Julian, I wondered if you could maybe say a few words about the material that we've been developing and using to work with groups, because you put a lot of work into it, and I think it's it continues the vein of what we've been discussing about the audiovisual stuff that we can use to get the message across, and the idea of getting groups together in areas.
Yes, as Jim and Agnes have said, I too got in touch with Andy just after the referendum. I came upon the book Moving On, and I realised that this was where we'd lost it, where we'd lost the referendum was at that point. So from then, we arranged for Andy to come and speak to us, just like I think Jim has said and Agnes has said, and Maggie, you also said, I think. And from these seminars, 4 seminars, which Andy ran with our Yes group, we then started to get together in Glasgow, and it struck me that if we were going to spread this further, it would be better if we could have more than one presenter. And to facilitate that, I created a presentation, a PowerPoint type presentation for each of the 4 seminars that Andy had delivered to us. And we discussed these in the group. They were modified and remodified, and we now have these 4 presentations which can be delivered remotely or in person if we ever get back to that kind of meeting. They can be delivered remotely via Zoom, and they cover the main points that the clean currency is all about in 4 sessions, plus a 5th session which really draws everything together, in which the participants air their own views, opinions, ask questions, respond to questions, and generally thrash out their understanding of currency and economics too, to some extent. So there are 2 on currency, 2 presentations on the economics, and 1 summary session. They last about, I don't know, it depends on how many questions are asked, how much discussion there is during the presentations, but I guess they last about an hour to an hour and a half. And they're available, and anybody that's interested. I mentioned them to Maggie down in Stranraer in an email. It might be of interest to her group down there to just ask Andy if we could arrange for them to see these presentations. I don't know, they're free to use, and I'm very willing to hand them over to anybody that wants to use them.
Lovely, lovely. Thanks, Julian. Ronnie, could we ask you to come in and say a few words?
I think a thread running through what I've heard this evening is linking the word wealth with that of currency. It's one of the things I think you've got to impress upon people at a fairly early stage is the difference. And I know Andy uses the word intrinsic. There's no intrinsic value, but it's very important that having got your hands on this printing press, that it doesn't get into the hands of the wrong people and, for instance, start asset inflation by simply pouring more money into the financial section to collect a few jobs. There's always great excuses to protect the financial sector. The financial sector is very well able to look after itself, probably better than any other sector in the economy. And we've got to direct whatever the government invests its new money in towards the creation of wealth, which means productive stuff, because we're going to have to export. As a small country, we're going to have to export quite a large proportion of what we make, whether it's services or physical goods. But this is something we've really got. It's very easy when people are first introduced to the currency question to say, this is the magic money tree. It's not a magic money tree, but when you've got control of your currency, if it's used wisely, and it's not at the moment in Westminster, but if it's used wisely, then it can be a terrific stimulus to the creation of wealth. That's all I've just got to add in.
Thanks, Ronnie. Thank you for that. And could we have Constitution for Scotland? I'm sorry, I can't remember your name.
It's John Hutchison. Sorry.
Oh, John. Sorry.
I think I've maybe got the name and the organisation the wrong way around. But thank you. I think this point that Jim and Andy and Ronnie have been speaking about control of the currency and being able to thereby influence the economy and actually create wealth, create activity, create a better Scotland. In terms of training, I think that's the most difficult concept. And I've sat myself down several times to try to understand this idea of, as Ronnie calls it, the printing press, to be able to take that forward. And I think that's the big barrier that I've got to overcome, and I'm sure others too. It'd be useful to hear from Agnes, maybe a contact, a means of being in touch with her, so that we can link into the Inverclyde activity. I know Constitution for Scotland were well received, by Inverclyde a few months ago, and that was really good. If I could also mention too, Andy spoke at the beginning about the intention to aim for a common public position, and I can really see how essential that is. And he mentioned one or two parties like Commonweal, Tim Rideout and the like. And it strikes me that an organisation like Believe in Scotland is quite influential in all of this. So in terms of reaching out to organisations and individuals to have this common and a non-controversial public position, could Andy tell us, does he think that anyone's left out of that loop who, that he's been unable to bring in? And maybe I'm over-egging it for Believe in Scotland, and perhaps I shouldn't do. I'm part of it, I suppose, not in a senior way, but in bringing everybody into the common fold, is anyone potentially out there still? Thank you.
Yes, that's true. There is a lot of people out there, and indeed, looking at the work done by Gordon McIntyre, it's very, very useful and helpful stuff as well. Again, his position on an independent currency is very much in line with the objectives that I set out in the first place. I think on the second point of what type of currency, what type of banking system, etc., there, like with many others, there'll be big differences. But the important thing is getting to winning the prize of the referendum first. And I think there's quite a lot of common ground right across the board, including with Gordon. I haven't spoken to Gordon about this, but I think there is a wide area of support that could be brought together. Attempts are being made to do that at the moment, and we're trying to sort of get a wider development, and quite a number of people come together. One of the problems, I have to say, is that some of the people that have been in contact with us and given us some valuable information are people who are actually employed in banking and elsewhere. And the last thing that you want to do, that I would want to do, is talk about who these people are, because the system that we work in is viciously cruel towards anybody who they see as undermining their position. But we've had people, young people, talk to us about a number of things which has been very, very important and helpful. So yes, I haven't worked out how we can extend this further. We must do it. We must get a wider discussion going. One of the things that Jim Osborne suggested is that he might come and do a session with a group of our people and put his views over and have debate and answer questions. So while we are still arguing with each other about certain things, we're quite happy to sort of have common discussions in areas where we agree. And the wider that we can extend that, the better. We wasted a lot of time with people like Commonweal and thought that we could get this done quickly. We didn't. We wasted a lot of time, and we should have spent a bit more time spreading our wings a bit further and talking to a lot more people. And Gordon would certainly be one that I'm interested in.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Anybody else like to ask a question or make a contribution, express their thoughts?
Maggie, just to make a wee point and just to remind people, because we do have some new people along tonight, that we are running the currency groups. Well, Andy is obviously running the currency groups, and we'll still look to set new ones up for anybody that wants to take part in them. So if anybody that's new, that hasn't been to one, that would like to take one or have one organised in their area, feel free to either to contact Andy direct or get in touch with myself on the email list, and we can look at getting one set up for you.
Excellent, Jim. Excellent. Thanks very much. Could I ask Leah if she would like to come back in and add any new thoughts or ideas that she's had from tonight?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Maggie. One thing I would say, I know that Jim Osborne couldn't be here this evening, but there is broad agreement when you're talking about a banking system for Scotland. And I think he outlined 3 things to make sure that the banks and the money that we put in the banks is going to be safe, which it currently is not under the UK system, and that we have a payment system that we can trust, that's robust and that's accessible to everybody. And that the main thing is that the banks that we have are actually allocating capital and lending for productive purposes and not for non-productive purposes. So those are sort of the 3 things he said that I think we all have agreement on, that we would like to see in Scotland. And just to say a couple of other arguments for our own currency that occurred to me is, in a future pandemic, and we will have future pandemics, with control of our own economy and currency, then we will be able to call the shots and, protect our population, provide furlough payments. We will also be able to increase pensions, which we're powerless to do at the moment because that's a reserved matter. So there's so many elements of having a well-being economy and a stronger, more successful and prosperous Scotland that can only come about with our independence and our financial independence. So I think keeping it to those broad arguments as to why we would be better off, why everyone would be better off, and making sure they understand those fundamentals, I think is really all we need to communicate. We don't have to get into the deep weeds and all of the banking regulations, which sometimes I listen to and I just sort of glaze over because I don't have a banking background. But I think, in terms of the broad objectives, that you want any system that we have to actually work for the people and for our prosperity. And we don't have that at the moment.
Absolutely. I think he mentioned in some of the stuff he's written about pensions is, the idea of having a pension that's in line with European pensions, I think is quite an attractive idea. And also the notion that we can invest pension funds into things like low-cost housing, particularly in places in rural areas and in the Highlands, because that is such a critical matter at the moment for people living in the Highlands and Islands who can't compete with the cost of local houses because folk with a bit of money from England and so on are able to buy up local housing offering prices that local people can't do. So, I think these kind of examples are excellent in terms of showing people immediately how well we can progress with control of our own currency, our own pensions, and our own investment situation.
And people are probably aware there was a second reading in the House of Commons yesterday about this health bill, which basically is privatizing NHS England. It's allowing private corporations onto the boards. And, will that impact Scotland? Yeah, it probably will. And so as we just sit back and nothing happens with the SNP government in terms of progressing the case for independence, Westminster is taking more and more away from us. it's time is of the essence. I'm getting actually quite concerned. I don't know how you guys feel, but it doesn't look great at the moment.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Anybody else? Julian? No? Oh, sorry, I thought I saw a yellow hand.
Yes, you do indeed see a yellow hand.
Oh, excellent.
I share very much what Leah and Mary have just said. The question I was going to put to everybody to see what you think is, has the appointment of a new committee of advisors on the transforming Scotland's economy in the next decade, will that make any difference to our situation, our approach to currency and the economic arrangements that we seek for Scotland? And one of the things is I'm really disappointed not to see any of the people that I regularly meet on these Zoom meetings in all kinds of fora. There's not one of them is on that committee. None of the people that, apart from by reputation, Nick Macpherson, none of the other people really, or there's there are one or two names I know, but none of them has appeared on any of the groups that have been working away doing hard work for the last 6 or 7 years on economics and currency. Not one of the people that I see is on that committee, and I just wonder, where are we? What's happening to our voice? Our voices seems not to be being listened to, and it would be very interesting to ask Kate Forbes, Agnes, because she is chairing this group, just how were they appointed and what is their remit? Because that is still not very clear. One thing I should say is it looks as though the Growth Commission is now history, and their recommendation for sterling is now in the bin, because Nick Macpherson, for one, is not an advocate of sharing sterling. And so I don't see how the Growth Commission can continue to have any influence whatsoever. But what do you think about this new committee? What are your thoughts on it?
Could I have a word about that? Because I spent most of the afternoon looking through the list of members of that committee and searching YouTube to see if I could find out who they were and what they thought one thing or another. And perhaps half a dozen of them have been able to come up with some sort of interesting information. Fundamentally, there's a thread of entrepreneurial success running through it. The guy, I can't remember his name, some of the names I can't recall, but the guy that runs the gaming, the very successful gaming manufacturing business in Dundee, he's on it, Van somebody. And he has a very interesting video on YouTube. And his obsession is, he's also in the Futures, what do they call it, the 2030 Futures Commission. He thinks that the technological changes which are going to happen in the next 10 years, that's the period of the brief of this committee, the technological changes are going to absolutely overwhelm any considerations of political nationalism or independence or anything like that. He thinks that that's independence is very much in the back burner because these technological changes are going to supersede everything and change our lives. And I think there's a lot of truth in what he said. He's a very intelligent guy and also very successful. And there's another guy called Blythe, Mark Blythe, who's an ex-Glaswegian economist and who's worked in the States for many years. There's an interview with him, which is very interesting too. He thinks that independence will eventually happen, but he's very keen that it should happen almost seamlessly. In other words, he's very keen that the financial sector is well looked after. Looking after the financial sector to me is a wolf in sheep's clothing. If you try and please the financial sector in Scotland, albeit it employs I'm told something like 80 or 8,000 people, thousands of people anyway, is an immensely important part of the Scottish economy. Now, that's not wealth, that's money. And to me, I'm not particularly concerned about that, but I do see that the man in the street is very concerned about it, because he will see he will see that all these banks closing and all these asset managers running away to London, etc. It's going to leave Scotland absolutely impoverished. That's an illusion we're going to have to fight. But I don't think this particular advisory commission is going to come out with the sort of answers that groups like ours would really like to hear. It's very much a business-orientated group, and in the brief, there is just nothing about independence. It's just a 10-year look at the economic future of Scotland, not in the context of independence at all.
No.
So I think it's a very good idea. I think what we should do is try and get a resolution to SNP conference. I've been a member since the 60s. A resolution through conference that these committees should have a grassroots content, and they should be required, because the constitution of the SNP is independence. That's what it exists for. It's in its constitution. These committees should be appointed with a grassroots representation, and should have to report in the context of a foreseeable independent situation.
Thanks very much for that, Ronnie. I think I absolutely agree with you. I think for myself, when I saw that it was a 10-year plan, my heart sank, because I think exactly what you've alluded to. How can you plan for independence? Are we talking? It's as though it's just been pushed away. It seems to me that you can do pre-indie planning, and you can discuss post-indie planning, but 10 years sounds as though it's been, just put to one side. Andy, do you want to respond to Julian's question?
Yes. Well, I mean, I agree entirely with what Ronnie's saying. This is the establishment. There's a different establishment. It's quite clear that Nick Macpherson is different from what they had at the time of the last group that was advising the government. But it's the establishment. The only way that we will make the substantial changes that are required, and let's face this, there are requirements, not just because we need and we need it, we want independence, we're seeking independence, that's one factor, but there are other big forces moving. One is the climate change. Climate change is going to demand changes, even if we weren't involved in independence. Independence helps us to tie in with that and to make it, but we're going to have to do it. There's going to have to be major changes. And the same in the context of the financial system. The financial system is bust. The whole system is falling apart. So there has to be something to take its place. And it's in that context that these changes have to actually take place. So setting up a body of establishment figures who'll talk about the establishment and how things used to be is not any good for how things ought to be and how we're going to change it. So really, we're going to have to make a case and push it through separately. One of the things you said tonight was in terms of Leah's contribution, and I noticed it as you did, the confidence and the way that she put her case across. That's absolutely vital for us in the process of putting our case across in a number of places. And that's what I was trying to do initially when I started this process of having these small groups get people with a bit of knowledge of the subject, and they feel a lot more confident, and they're then able to speak more confidently. And if you can get people to do that, you can make a lot of changes.
Well, the coronavirus has managed to make that point very effectively, hasn't it, with its R numbers?
Yeah, absolutely.
Infect 1, you infect 7, 7's 49, 49 is thousands.
Anybody else like to come in on this? Questions, points?
Presumably there would be quite a lot of parties wanting to see a Scottish currency fail. What kind of, how could we protect our currency? I mean, would we tie the currency to the euro, or would we tie the currency to, the pound? I mean, the pound's an international currency. Presumably, there isn't any reason why we would have to stop using the pound. But I was wondering, in a situation, where there was a run on a Scottish currency, I mean, what sort of measures would we be able to take as an independent country to, stop any of these issues arising in the first place?
Well, that raises a whole number of questions about the system, and that's why we spent so much time talking in detail about the issue of the economics and the currency. One or two things have to be clear. Currency itself has got no intrinsic value. Money has got no intrinsic value. So the money itself can't alter the economy. It's the other way around. It's the economy, the resources that you have and the production processes that you have that creates the wealth. Right? It's the other way around. That's how it happens. So when you hear about a system where the outside world can change the value of your currency and through that your economy, then there's something wrong. That should never be possible. It should never be possible to happen. Like it happened in Greece, where Greece was tied to the currency instead of the economy. So you have to be the other way around. Scotland would have to be the other way around. Make sure that its currency was in line with its economy. And it's the economy that's important. And as Leah pointed out earlier, our small country is very wealthy in the context of its natural resources, in the context of its workforce, in the context of its infrastructure. So it wouldn't be difficult. In fact, it would be almost impossible not to make an independent Scotland a wealthy country. It would be almost impossible to do that. So if we organise the economy properly, then that's what would protect the currency. But of course, we would have to have a different system from the system we have now. Completely different system. We wouldn't want an international currency for Scotland. In fact, England can't sustain one themselves either. And Britain can't sustain an international currency. The whole thing's falling apart. So we would want a domestic currency that only applied within Scotland, and we'd have another process for international exchange. At the moment, there's lots of discussion about changes taking place exactly in this field. There's the whole talk about changing the international exchange system, changing the central banks and and producing digital currencies from the central banks. This is all taking place right now. There are deadlines for new central bank currencies coming in. So in 3-4 years' time, the whole world process of currency and how currencies are valued and how it is exchanged and the exchange values, that's all going to change. Some of the process of change now. So if we were looking at it looking at the past and saying, can we protect it as it was done in the past? That's no longer relevant. We have to look at what's happening now in the future and build from there.
Could I try and answer your original question more directly? How do you stop the financial markets getting hold of the Scottish pound and trashing it. I think that's what your worry was. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's more like, you must excuse us. We were quite late in joining this conversation. We couldn't get a link in, so I perhaps missed the first part, where the discussions on this were taking place. But nevertheless, Ronnie, if you can give us some, give us some idea as to how you would answer that as well. Yeah, that would be.
It's a very relative question, which everybody wants to know. And I say, because you hear so often that it's all going to be such a terrible disaster, and if you haven't got something to come back with, then on the doorstep you're a bit left flat-footed. But fundamentally, as Andy says, it depends who's going to be in charge. But we would recommend that the Scottish pound is purely a domestic currency and is not recognised outside of the country at all. Now, you say, well, how do you stop that? I'll tell you how you stop it. The central bank issues the currency and says it will not recognise any transaction which it does not approve in accordance with the Constitution. Now, if that Constitution says that it will be a domestic currency and only valid within the borders, then speculators cannot deal with it. Even if some Scot takes a suitcase of pounds outside the country and tries to use it in some way speculatively to our detriment. At the end of the day, it's got to be settled in something more than a suitcase of fivers, because it's got to be settled by a credit being made by the banking system to settle a deal which has been made in a financial market. Are you with me so far? Now,
yeah, sure.
If currency speculators are told right from the very beginning that the central bank of Scotland will not recognise transactions out with the border of the country, and this is purely a domestic currency, then they can't deal with it. Now, there is a precedent for that. That's what Malaya did during the Southeast Asian crisis on the ringgit, and it worked perfectly. They just said, we just don't recognise it, and it just died overnight because nobody could make any sense of it. You couldn't make money out of it or trash it, even if that's what you wanted to do. So yes, it's provided the central bank makes that law and enforces it, then then you're safe against that. That doesn't mean to say that you can't peg your currency to sterling. Of course you can. That's entirely up to the internal management of the monetary policy. But what you can do is I'm drying up now. So,
Thanks, Ronnie. Thanks. I mean, essentially, we're saying.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, essentially, we're saying we'd have
it opens up a whole number of other channels.
Strict financial controls that banking we'd be cleaning up the banks. We'd be having a different kind of banking system that wouldn't be allowed to play havoc with the economy. But that's a whole other area. Anybody else? Because I think maybe anybody else want to? Yep, Julian. Do you want to come in, Julian?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it does relate back to John and the Constitution, that the currency must be under the control of the Constitution, so that you don't have the vulnerability to outside interference. Just a thing I was going to throw in to leave you with. I'm very much a believer in having the correct model. The Titanic sank because the steersman was following the wrong model. He was a tiller steersman, and he was operating a wheel steering. Now, with a tiller, you push the tiller away from, you push the tiller towards the object you're trying to avoid. With a wheel, you turn the wheel, as in a car, away from the object you want to avoid. So the steersman initially pushed the tiller away from the iceberg, sending the bows towards the iceberg, and that resulted in disaster. So following the wrong model results in disaster. And I think it also applies in economic theory. If you're following the wrong model, if you're following the neoliberal model, then you are running into disaster, and we're seeing the disaster all around us in various ways. You need to start with a model which applies to the situation. And a more recent example is my brother-in-law, who had a head-on collision with a European tourist who drove on the wrong side of the road, and he was put into the wrong model by roadworks, which changed his driving on the left to driving on the right to avoid the roadworks. And he then continued with that model, subconsciously forgetting where he was. And when he saw my brother-in-law heading towards him, he steered towards his right-hand side. Brother-in-law steered towards his left-hand side, both applying different models, and the result was disaster. Following the wrong model often results in disastrous consequences. So we must have an economic model which accurately represents the situation. And the one that I'm thinking of is the tax and spend. The order of processes is spend and then tax. And so you see it every day practically. For example, today there was a headline about taxing sugar and salt. And the taxes and the justification on the BBC was the taxes raised could be spent on free meals for children. That is not the way things work, and yet everybody seems to have this model in their minds, which is exactly the opposite of the way things really are. So I'm not holding my breath for this committee that's been appointed, following even the right model. As you say, they're dominated by private entrepreneurs. The last committee was dominated by economists, all of whom seem to follow the neoliberal line. Bigger Economics and Charlotte Street Partners were all heavily influential in the Growth Commission. And now I don't see this new committee as being really very much different. It's weighted in another direction, but still, as Andy said, or Ronnie said, it's the establishment at work again. So I've taken up too much time, so I'll...
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Julian. Right.
Could I just finish off where I dried up the last time with a couple of words? I was going to say that the closed pound of a domestic economy, we use our sterling reserves to trade with overseas people. We don't use the Scots pound. We use sterling because we will be quite well off in terms of sterling, because we currently in Scotland own something like £60 billion worth of sterling assets in bank accounts and one thing and another. And the conversion of that into the Scottish currency will be done not by money markets, but by the central bank. So we will have quite a handsome reserve of sterling when we replace it with the Scottish currency. It's not going to be obligatory, but if you want to buy anything in Scotland or pay your taxes, then you're going to have some Scots pounds. So that's where our foreign currency comes from for trading.
Lovely, Ronnie. Thank you. Well, yep. Is that somebody else coming in? Mr. McLeod?
All right, yeah, it was just, I think that from what I understand, Ronnie and Andy saying, you're essentially saying that any currency has got to be tied to a constitution initially. Is that really correct in my understanding of the answers that you gave me? a constitution is essential in order to be able to control your currency?
Well, what we are saying in the New Scotland is that there should be within we should have a written constitution for a start, which we don't have now. And in that written constitution, there should be provision for ensuring that the currency is taken as a serious issue, as something that belongs to the people, and certain conditions specified, which are in the draft constitution as is currently drafted. The reason for that is that, you know, what Ronnie explained about the currency, we don't have a problem in terms of international exchange. We have our own currency in Scotland. It only applies to Scotland, doesn't apply anywhere else. And when we're doing international trade, we will have a huge amount of reserves in sterling, and we'll have that when we do the changeover, and that will be held in the central bank and will be used to deal with balance of payments problems, you know, where you sell not enough for what you're buying in and you've got a deficit or a gap. That's what these reserves are used for, to ensure that operates. So that system would work entirely on its own. The question you were asking was about, what was that? What was the question you were asking?
The question really essentially was that the situation has really got to be tied to a constitution.
The constitutional role is to tie in certain principles as to how it would run. But how it would actually run on an economic basis is relatively straightforward. It's not very difficult. It would run relatively straightforward, but quite different from what's happening now. It'd be quite different from what's happening now. So you can't look at the model as it is now. People say to you now, there's speculation from outside, and that can happen now because of the system we have. But all that system would have to be dumped. We'd have to change the system completely and have a different system guaranteed by principles set in the Constitution.
The model constitution suggests that the state is the sole source of a Scottish pound, whatever form that pound takes, whether it's a pound note in your hand, a physical thing, whether it's digital currency issued by the Bank of Reserves, or whether it is the credit issued to you when you go into your own bank and get an overdraft. In other words, at the moment, you can go into a bank, as you probably know, and the bank doesn't need to have £10 in order to give you the credit of £10 in your account. It creates a balance sheet credit and a balance sheet liability. So really, private banks have the ability to create currency. Now, that is fundamentally what's wrong with the system. So the constitution that we are promoting, anyway, in the model, it's up to people what is eventually voted for. But fundamentally, what we're saying is the state is the sole provider of currency, whether it is credit or any other form. And there's no substitute for that. And if you do try and substitute for it, then you break the law and are locked up. Now, that, of course, is to the banks and the financial sector anathema. But fundamentally, if you want to control your currency, you can imagine you're going to have to stop private banks creating it.
Okay, the only question I would have there regarding what you're saying, you know, I don't doubt what you're saying. Are there any parallel systems run on this basis in the rest of Western Europe? I mean, does Sweden run a similar sort of, does Denmark, does...
Every country except this country now have mutual institutions like, and you're a young chap compared with me, but you'll still remember building societies.
Yes, indeed.
Building societies and credit unions, they're all mutuals. They can only lend as much money as savers and depositors put into the
Right. That comes on to my next question, which is really a core question. Maggie Thatcher essentially privatised the mutuals. What's to stop, you know, a Westminster government or some other government, you know, acting in a similar situation once again?
Well, that's precisely why you need to have it in the Constitution. That's precisely why, so that a government can't change it. That's why we want it into the Constitution, so that it would be unconstitutional for a government elected to try and do that. That's why we want it in the Constitution. Right? That explains precisely the situation.
The only way that could be changed is if there was the government proposed a referendum. This is under the model constitution. If the government proposed a referendum to have another Thatcherite Big Bang, and it would have to go to the public referendum, and then if the people voted yes, that's what we want, then that would happen. But fundamentally, I doubt that's going to happen.
Right. Okay. I think that answers the question. I should perhaps have, posted my core question initially. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I think now I'm going to say that we've had a very useful and interesting discussion. It's quite clear we're going to have to use all methods of audiovisual aids, the material that we have as part of Campaign for a Clean Currency. We've got books that we want to get out there to help the movement. And we're looking for, maybe we'll come together and find a simple fact sheet as was suggested by Leah. But clearly, there's a lot of interest in how we manage our Scottish economy after independence and how we set up banks that we can trust. And as Leah spoke about in Germany, where there are banks that serve communities rather than communities funding banks that do what they like. So I think I would like to say thank you very much to Leah and Agnes and Andy and Ronnie and Julian and everybody who's made a contribution or asked a question. The asking of questions is the most important bit. And we've got a message here from Jim that talks about the link for Andy's books. And I would like to say thanks so much for doing this. We will be doing more meetings of this kind. Thank you very much for joining us, and go well, everybody. And I think good night. Take care.
Thank
you. All the best. Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Rudy. Bye-bye.
You're listening to Indie Live Radio, Yes Group Spotlight. We just like to say thank you very much to the Campaign for a Clean Currency for letting us rebroadcast a recent meeting. If you'd like to find out some more about what the Campaign for a Clean Currency is about, what their plans are, then we suggest you get hold of the books written by Andy Anderson. He wrote about the clean currency before the 2014 referendum. Then he updated that in a book after the referendum, and that book is called Currency in an Independent Scotland. More recently, he's written a book called A Clean Currency for a Prosperous Scotland. That was published in 2019. And if you want to get hold of those books, go to andersonpublications.co.uk. So Anderson Publications, all one word, andersonpublications.co.uk, and you'll be able to order them there. Once again, thank you from the Indie Live Radio team to the Campaign for a Clean Currency in Independent Scotland. Roll on the day.